today's true crime documentary on dark bonds, we delve into the chilling and haunting case of Jesse Valencia. Jesse was more than just another face in a crowded lecture hall. He was vibrant, beloved, and full of life, a college student living the dream in the mid-2000s. His days at the university brimmed with promise, but when the brightness of his life was suddenly extinguished, his name became entwined with a tragic mystery. Jesse was found dead. The discovery of his body triggered a homicide investigation that swiftly captured the attention of the Columbia Police Department. They began uncovering threads that led to a web of suspects. Yet the truth behind Jesse's death pointed to someone who existed far outside their expectations, a twist they never saw coming. We travel back to the summer of 2004. Columbia, Missouri, set the stage, a city alive with energy. Known for its youthful pulse and brimming with college students, it was the kind of place where dreams began and where the University of Missouri stood as its heartbeat. Every year, thousands of young people flooded Columbia, their ambitions etched in books and late-night laughter. For the local police, most of the trouble they dealt with came from the ordinary chaos of youth, house parties that spiraled out of control, drunken scuffles in neon-lit streets. But violent crime was almost a foreign concept. Murders were a rarity, a true anomaly. And then, everything changed. June 5th, 2004. The exact hour remains uncertain. Morning, afternoon, or somewhere in between. Sources differ. What doesn't waver is the fact that this ordinary day was shattered by an extraordinary and harrowing discovery. It started like any other day, ordinary and unassuming. But for a group of college students walking near the East Campus area of the University of Missouri, it would end in a discovery that would shatter the calm of this college town. They were strolling past a row of apartment buildings, lost in conversation, when they spotted something, or someone, lying in the grass between two buildings. At first glance, it seemed harmless. This was Columbia, after all, where students often celebrated with reckless abandon. Perhaps this was just another partygoer who'd had one drink too many and passed out in the night air. But as they drew closer, the scene shifted from casual to horrific. The figure on the ground wasn't simply sleeping. He was motionless. His body was soaked in blood, the deep crimson staining the grass beneath him. Breathless, unmoving, the students froze in shock before instinctively calling the police. Within moments, the area was cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the summer breeze. What lay before the officers was unsettling. A young man sprawled on the grass, his body stripped of almost everything but blue boxer shorts. His face turned upward, and his neck was drenched in blood, the stain spreading outward in dark, uneven patches. Initially, the officers grasped at straws, theorizing on the spot. Could this have been a tragic accident? Perhaps the man had fallen from the rooftop above. Columbia, with its vibrant party culture, wasn't a stranger to drunken escapades gone wrong. Maybe he had climbed onto the roof, disoriented, and attempted an ill-fated jump between buildings. A moment of daring turned fatal, but as they examined him more closely, those initial thoughts unraveled. The truth was more sinister than anyone standing there could have imagined. The truth revealed itself in a horrifying detail that silenced any lingering hopes of an accident or mistake. This young man's throat had been slashed, a gaping, deep wound, carved with precision and cruelty by a sharp, serrated knife. It was this wound that ended his life, as later confirmed in the autopsy. The cut was so devastating that it nearly reached his spine. Yet, no knife, no murder weapon was found near the scene. For the police, there was another unsettling element to this already gruesome discovery. The victim's body bore few defensive wounds. This absence struck investigators as deeply unusual. Knife attacks are often frantic, desperate struggles. A victim instinctively raises their hands to block or grab at the blade, leaving cuts and slashes on their arms and hands. But this man's body told a quieter, more perplexing story. There were bruises, yes, marks across his breastbone, shoulders, and a single dark blotch in the center of his back. Yet his hands and arms bore no traces of a struggle. This wasn't a fight. This was something else entirely. The medical examiner soon unraveled the mystery. Hemorrhaging in the victim's windpipe and eyes revealed a grim prelude to the violence. The man had been choked, strangled with enough force to render him unconscious. His body had been deprived of oxygen, collapsing into helplessness. Only then, in that suspended state, had his killer struck. The knife cut wasn't a frenzied attack, but a cold, calculated execution. The coroner placed his time of death in the early hours of June 5th, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., as the city slept. This brutal act played out in the shadows. Bloodstains on the grass confirmed that the murder had happened where the body was found. This wasn't a body dumped to hide a crime. It was the crime itself, raw and unhidden, carried out in the quiet space between two apartment buildings. For those who found him and the officers who first arrived, the weight of what happened began to settle like a sick, suffocating fog. A deliberate, ruthless act of violence had unfolded in the heart of a town that was supposed to be alive with youthful dreams, not shadowed by death. The first hurdle for investigators was to answer the most pressing question. Who was this young man? Without identification on the body, the task wasn't straightforward. Dressed only in blue boxer shorts, there was nothing, no wallet, no ID, that could offer them a name. He was a blank slate in the most tragic way. Frustrated but determined, the officers turned to the crowd that had begun gathering around the crime scene. News of the discovery had spread quickly in the tight-knit college town, and a growing group of curious onlookers lingered near the yellow tape. The police began canvassing them, asking the same question again and again. Did anyone recognize him? It was a long shot, but then someone stepped forward. They thought they knew who the victim was. His name is Jesse Valencia, they told the officers, a 23-year-old young man. The tip was a spark in the dark, and soon after, it was confirmed. The murdered man was indeed Jesse Valencia. Before diving further into the investigation, it's important to understand who Jesse was, the life behind the name. Born on February 22, 1981, Jesse came from Kentucky. His upbringing was far from typical. His mother, Linda, was a strong and loving figure in his life, while his biological father was largely absent, a ghost in the background. But Linda found love again, marrying a man named Lupe Valencia. Together, they had 2 daughters, Rachel and Maria, making Jesse the eldest of 3. From the very start, Jesse stood out. Linda described him as a beacon of light, a boy who was quick to smile, endlessly chatty, and always able to turn a stranger into a friend. He was magnetic in a way that few people are, brimming with charm and humor. But behind the laughter, Jesse carried a secret. He knew he was gay from a very young age. At just 10 years old, he sat his mother down, trembling with fear, and confessed his truth. Tears spilled as he told her, terrified that it would fracture the bond they shared. Linda, however, was unshaken. Her love for her son was unyielding. She held him close and reassured him, making it clear that who he was, every part of him, was something to be celebrated, not feared. Jesse's relief was palpable, and from that day forward, he carried himself with more confidence, bolstered by his mother's unwavering support. That confidence followed him into adulthood, where Jesse continued to be a vibrant and beloved presence, but the light that shone so brightly in him had now been snuffed out, leaving the question no one could escape: who had taken Jesse's life, and why? After coming out to his mother and receiving her unconditional support, Jesse Valencia blossomed into a confident, self-assured young man. That sense of freedom allowed him to embrace life fully, carrying his charm and charisma into every room he entered. In high school, Jesse dabbled in modeling. He posed for photo shoots with ease, his confidence and natural presence capturing attention. His family believed this would be his future, a career under the bright lights, gracing magazines and billboards. But as Jesse grew, his ambitions shifted. The glitz of modeling no longer called to him. Instead, he set his sights on something far more demanding. He wanted to become a lawyer. Jesse had always been passionate, argumentative, and fiercely committed to standing up for what he believed in. It wasn't hard to imagine him in a courtroom, defending the defenseless and challenging injustices with that same vibrant energy he brought to everything else. After graduating high school, Jesse left his small Kentucky hometown and moved to Columbia, Missouri, to pursue his dream. He enrolled at the University of Missouri as a pre-law student and settled into an apartment not far from campus. Between classes, Jesse worked part-time at a local motel and quickly built a strong social circle. Life seemed to be falling into place for him. He was thriving, academically, socially, and personally, and then suddenly, he was gone. The news of Jesse's murder hit everyone like a thunderclap. The people closest to him were baffled. Jesse had no known enemies. He was warm, friendly, and universally liked. Who could have wanted him dead, and why? These were the questions that now consumed the Columbia Police Department as they launched their investigation. The first place to start was Jesse's apartment, just a block away from the crime scene. Investigators combed through the space, collecting everything that might offer a clue. They found cigarettes, a phone that could provide vital call records, and even a used condom on the floor, each item carefully bagged and cataloged for analysis. While detectives searched the apartment, others canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to Jesse's neighbors. It wasn't long before one neighbor came forward with a lead. He recalled that on the night of Jesse's murder, he had returned home drunk around 3 a.m. After collapsing into bed, his sleep was soon disrupted by loud shouting from Jesse's apartment. It sounded like an argument, heated, angry, and unmistakable. Frustrated, the neighbor had banged on Jesse's door, yelling for them to keep it down. Afterward, he stumbled back to his bed and fell asleep. He placed the shouting around 4 a.m., a detail that now lined up chillingly with Jesse's time of death. For the police, the implications were clear. Whoever Jesse was arguing with in those early hours was likely his killer. Now, the task was to figure out who that person was. And it wasn't long before the investigation took a sharp, shocking turn. Just hours after Jesse Valencia's body was discovered, the police's attention was drawn to a young man standing among the crowd of onlookers near the crime scene. He wasn't merely curious or shocked like the others. He was visibly distressed, tears streaming down his face, his sorrow unmissable. When the officers approached him, they learned why. This man, Jack Barry, was one of Jesse's ex-boyfriends. Jack told the police that he had only just heard the devastating news. A friend had contacted him to say Jesse was dead. He couldn't believe it. His grief was raw and immediate, the heartbreak of someone who had once been deeply connected to the victim. Given their relationship history, Jack quickly became a person of interest. The police knew that when a murder occurs, an ex-partner often warrants close scrutiny, particularly if emotions like jealousy, anger, or resentment might be at play. Was Jack holding on to a grudge? Had their relationship ended in bitterness? Could this be a crime of passion? Jack willingly accompanied the officers to the station, where he answered their questions, explained that he and Jesse had been together for about 2 years, though their relationship had recently come to an end. The breakup wasn't explosive or dramatic. They had simply grown apart. But, Jack admitted, Jesse had taken it harder than he had. Jesse wasn't ready to let go. According to Jack, Jesse had struggled to accept the reality of their breakup. Meanwhile, Jack was ready to move forward. He had even started seeing someone new, which, the police, raised an unsettling possibility. Could Jesse's unwillingness to move on have led to a confrontation that night? Could Jack, in his attempt to sever ties for good, have lost control in a moment of anger? The detectives pressed Jack for an alibi for the night of Jesse's death. Jack claimed that he had been home alone, asleep. It was a thin, unverifiable story, one that left the police uneasy. With no witnesses to confirm his account, Jack couldn't be ruled out. The case grew more tangled when investigators reviewed Jesse's phone records. At 3:18 a.m., just hours before his body was found, Jesse had tried to call Jack. The timing was chilling. What had Jesse needed to say in those moments? Why had he reached out to his ex? And what had happened after that unanswered call? The investigators couldn't ignore the mounting questions about Jack Barry. But with no concrete evidence yet, they had no choice but to keep digging. If Jack wasn't the killer, the answer lay elsewhere, hidden in the shadows of Jesse Valencia's final hours. Around the same time, Jack recalled hearing a knock at his front door. He didn't answer it. It was late, and the weight of the day had pushed him toward sleep. Still, the timing nagged at him. Could it have been Jesse? Perhaps Jesse had called to ask Jack to let him in. Jack couldn't say for certain. The police couldn't confirm it either. It was one more piece of a confusing and fragmented puzzle. As Jack continued his interview, hours stretching into an emotional ordeal. His guilt began to seep through. His voice broke as he told detectives he regretted not answering the door. If it had been Jesse, perhaps he could have saved him. It was clear Jack wasn't just upset. He was shattered. The detectives felt the sincerity in his words. His anguish was raw and genuine. This wasn't the face of a killer. Their instincts were right. Jack Barry was innocent. Even so, they pressed him to consider who might have wanted to hurt Jesse. But Jack was at a loss. Jesse, as far as Jack knew, had no enemies. The police broadened their search, turning to Jesse's social circle. Friends described Jesse as vibrant, social, and kind. But one name surfaced repeatedly: Zev Vinetuck. Zev was a fellow student, someone Jesse had only recently befriended. Their interactions had been casual at first, but some of Jesse's friends suspected there was something more between them. Were Jesse and Zev romantically involved? Rumors suggested it might be true, but that Zev wasn't entirely comfortable with his sexuality. He was reportedly struggling to reconcile his identity with his public persona, hiding parts of himself from the world. The rumors didn't stop there. Whispers circulated that Zev's car had been seen near the area where Jesse's body was discovered. The timing was too close to ignore. The police brought Zev in for questioning, hoping for clarity. Zev denied any romantic relationship with Jesse. They were just friends, he claimed, nothing more. When pressed about the night of Jesse's murder, Zev provided an alibi eerily similar to Jack's. He had been at home, sleeping. But unlike Jack, Zev wasn't alone. He lived with his parents. Investigators interviewed them, and they backed Zev's story without hesitation. They insisted he hadn't left the house that night and wouldn't have been able to do so without their knowledge. Despite Zev's solid alibi, questions lingered. The nature of his relationship with Jesse remained ambiguous, and the whispers surrounding his potential presence near the crime scene gnawed at the investigators. For now, though, Zev was a loose thread in a case that desperately needed unraveling. Zev Vinetuck's alibi was strengthened by a peculiar detail. His parents explained to the police that the garage door of their house made an exceptionally loud noise whenever it was opened. This noise was so distinct and noticeable that if Zev had left the house at any point during the night, they would have heard it. But they insisted they hadn't heard anything, and Zev's account of staying home all night remained consistent with theirs. This information, combined with the overall lack of direct evidence against him, led investigators to temporarily move him off their list of primary suspects. Zev wasn't entirely ruled out, but the police decided to shift their focus to other possible leads in the case. To move the investigation forward, detectives concentrated on retracing Jesse Valencia's last known movements. They already knew that Jesse had been killed sometime between 3 and 5 a.m. on June 5th. However, based on the neighbor's statement about hearing shouting around 4 a.m., they suspected that Jesse's murder likely occurred closer to the latter part of that time frame. Now the task was to figure out what Jesse had been doing in the hours leading up to his murder. Specifically, the detectives wanted to understand where he had been and who he had been with during the evening of June 4th. After gathering information from interviews and other sources, they discovered that Jesse had worked a shift at the motel where he was employed part-time earlier that evening. Once his shift ended, Jesse went to a party hosted by a friend at their house. He arrived at the party at approximately 11 p.m. and spent most of the evening socializing, drinking, and enjoying himself. According to witnesses, Jesse spent much of the party in the company of a 22-year-old man named Ed McDevitt. Ed wasn't just another casual acquaintance in Jesse's life. The two had met only a few days earlier, but had quickly become close. Their relationship had already turned sexual, and the police later confirmed that Ed's DNA was present on the condom found in Jesse's apartment. That condom, collected as evidence during the investigation, was connected to a night they had spent together 2 days prior to Jesse's murder. On the night of the party, Jesse and Ed appeared to be getting along well. They stayed close to each other throughout the evening, talking and drinking. Witnesses recalled that they left the party together around 3 a.m. The two men began walking toward Jesse's apartment, which wasn't far from where the party had taken place. At this point in the timeline, police knew they were dealing with a critical juncture. The fact that Ed McDevitt had been the last person seen with Jesse before his murder made him an immediate person of interest in the investigation. The police needed to determine whether Ed had anything to do with Jesse's death. Ed was brought into the police station for questioning. During his interview, Ed admitted that he and Jesse had been at the party together and had left at the same time. He confirmed they were walking in the direction of Jesse's apartment. However, Ed claimed that he didn't actually go back to the apartment with Jesse. According to Ed, at some point during their walk, the two parted ways. Ed said that Jesse continued walking toward his apartment while Ed went home alone. This account placed Ed squarely in the spotlight. If true, it meant that Ed had left Jesse alive and well. But if it wasn't true, it meant Ed could have been hiding critical information about what happened in the final moments of Jesse's life. With Ed's statement now on record, the detectives added him to their growing list of suspects. His proximity to Jesse in those crucial hours was undeniable, but whether he had been involved in the murder or not remained an unanswered question. For now, the police had another thread to pull. Jesse's timeline was beginning to take shape, but the investigation had a long way to go before the truth would emerge. Ed McDevitt explained that after he and Jesse left the party, they eventually said goodbye and parted ways, each heading toward their respective homes. However, Ed claimed that they stayed on the phone with each other while walking alone. This detail was later corroborated by the police when they examined Jesse's phone records. They confirmed that Jesse and Ed had been on a call around 3:13 a.m. Ed maintained that the last time he saw Jesse, he was alive and walking toward his apartment. While his account seemed plausible, the police couldn't rely solely on his word. They needed to confirm his story, and they soon did. Investigators spoke to Ed's roommate, who provided critical corroboration. The roommate stated that they were still awake when Ed returned home that night and confirmed Ed had arrived back at the time he claimed. Importantly, this was before the time frame in which Jesse was believed to have been killed. Ed's alibi checked out, and once again, the investigators hit a dead end. Ed McDevitt was cleared as a suspect, joining Jack Barry and Zev Vinetuck as individuals without any concrete connection to the crime. Despite this, the investigation pressed forward. Without a clear suspect, the detectives turned to DNA evidence, hoping it might offer a breakthrough. Jesse's autopsy had yielded several samples and swabs, all of which were submitted for testing. Among these were fingernail scrapings, which were sent to a lab for analysis. In addition, authorities had discovered hairs on Jesse's chest during the autopsy. These weren't Jesse's hairs. Forensic analysis revealed that the hairs were limb hairs, either from an arm or a leg, and the police believed they belonged to the killer. The hairs were carefully collected and sent for DNA testing, with the hope they would identify the perpetrator. While the scientists began their meticulous work in the lab, the officers continued investigating, leaving no stone unturned. They spoke to Jesse's friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, piecing together every detail of his social life. It was during an interview with one of Jesse's friends, Andy, that they uncovered a potentially explosive lead. Andy, a fellow college student, had been more than just Jesse's friend. Their relationship was casual and intimate, a friends with benefit situation rather than a romantic partnership. However, Andy had an alibi that excluded him entirely from the crime. He hadn't been in the area on the night of Jesse's murder, and the police were able to confirm this without question. Although Andy wasn't a suspect, he shared a piece of information that turned the investigation on its head. Andy revealed that Jesse had been involved with another man in the weeks leading up to his death. This wasn't just any man, it was someone with authority, someone whose position added a layer of complexity to the case. According to Andy, Jesse had been occasionally sleeping with a police officer, and not just any officer. This man worked for the Columbia Police Department, the very same department now investigating Jesse's murder. The revelation Andy provided about Jesse's involvement with a police officer was nothing short of shocking. Andy explained that his knowledge of this relationship stemmed from an incident that occurred on May 14, 2004, just 3 weeks before Jesse's murder. On that night, Andy was at Jesse's apartment. The two were in bed together when a sudden knock at the door broke the stillness of the night. Jesse got out of bed to answer it, leaving Andy to wait in confusion. Standing at the door was a uniformed police officer. His appearance was both unexpected and inexplicable. Andy remained in bed, watching the scene unfold. He couldn't understand why an officer had arrived in the middle of the night. Jesse, however, seemed completely at ease. He glanced at Andy and said, "Don't worry, he's cool." The officer stepped into the apartment as if he were familiar with the space. Jesse closed the door behind him, and to Andy's astonishment, the officer addressed them casually. He told them to carry on with whatever they had been doing. Without any hesitation, the officer then began to remove his uniform. Before Andy fully processed what was happening, the officer climbed into bed with him and Jesse. What followed was an intimate encounter that left Andy bewildered and uncertain of what to think. When it was over, the officer got up, dressed quickly, and spoke to both men. "You can't tell anyone about this." His tone left no room for argument. His words were heavy with authority, making it clear that this was not a request, but an order. As the officer prepared to leave, Jesse called after him, asking, "When will I see you again?" The officer's response was vague and dismissive. "You'll see me when you see me," he replied. With that, the officer left the apartment, leaving Andy confused and uneasy about what had just occurred. To Andy, it was obvious that Jesse and this officer had known each other long before that night. Their interaction suggested an ongoing relationship, one that the officer was determined to keep secret. Andy couldn't shake the strangeness of the encounter. He realized that now, after Jesse's murder, this information might be critical. When detectives heard Andy's story, they were utterly stunned. The implications of an intimate relationship between Jesse and a police officer were enormous. It also raised troubling questions about the investigation itself. If this officer had been so closely connected to Jesse, why hadn't he come forward during the investigation? Why hadn't his name surfaced in connection with Jesse before now? The detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that this officer might be linked to Jesse's death. The revelation added a new layer of complexity to the case, demanding immediate and thorough investigation. The detectives couldn't help but wonder why the officer Andy described hadn't come forward on his own. Surely, he would have known that the investigation required speaking to everyone who had been connected to Jesse. His silence seemed suspicious, raising questions about whether he might be hiding something. Was it possible that this officer was involved in Jesse's death? Could one of their own be responsible for such a brutal crime? After hearing Andy's story, their next step was clear. They had to identify this officer. Unfortunately, Andy didn't know the officer's name. He explained that he had only met the man once and hadn't learned his name during that encounter. However, Andy was confident that he would recognize the officer if he saw him again. To help Andy identify him, detectives decided to show him a photo book containing pictures of all the officers in the Columbia Police Department. They walked Andy through the station to a room where the book was kept. The plan was for Andy to look through the photos and pick out the officer he had seen at Jesse's apartment. But before they even reached the room, something unexpected happened. As Andy walked through the hallway with the detectives, he suddenly stopped. He turned to the detectives and said, "I literally just passed him." Andy pointed out the officer he had just seen walking down the hall. The officer he identified was Stephen Rios, a 27-year-old member of the Columbia Police Department. Stephen Rios had been working as a patrol officer with the department for about 3 years. He was well regarded by his colleagues, who frequently praised him as a passionate and ambitious officer. Rios was seen as someone who was deeply committed to his work and had earned respect within the department. Outside of his professional life, Stephen Rios appeared to have an ideal personal life as well. He was a married man with a wife and a young son, just a few months old at the time of the investigation. To those who knew him, Stephen Rios seemed like a model officer and a devoted family man. However, now that Andy had identified him, detectives were forced to confront the possibility that Rios might not be who he seemed. Despite their initial disbelief, the detectives knew that Andy's account couldn't be ignored. They understood that they needed to investigate Stephen Rios thoroughly, no matter how difficult it might be to accept what they might find. By the time Rios was identified as a potential suspect, he was out of town on a camping trip with a few of his colleagues. It was a short trip, but while he was away, the detectives worked to piece together his movements from the day Jesse's body was discovered. What they learned was deeply unsettling. Rios had been at the crime scene that day, not as a suspect, but as an officer on duty. His shift began in the afternoon, and after Jesse's body was found, Rios informed his sergeant that he wanted to visit the scene to see if he could assist with the investigation. If Rios was the killer, his presence at the scene was chilling. The idea that he might have been there, overseeing the investigation into a crime he had committed, disturbed the detectives. Shortly after Jesse was identified as the victim, Rios told his fellow officers that he had met Jesse Valencia before. He explained that their interaction occurred a couple of months earlier, on April 18, 2004. On that day, Jesse had been at a friend's house for a party that grew loud and disruptive. The noise prompted a neighbor to call the police to file a complaint. Rios was one of the officers dispatched to the scene to address the issue and ask the partygoers to quiet down. However, Jesse, who was studying law at the time, became argumentative with the officers. He challenged their authority, asking questions like, "What's your probable cause?" It was clear Jesse's confidence was bolstered by his legal studies, and he appeared to be slightly intoxicated during the interaction. His defiance escalated the situation, and the officers ultimately decided to arrest him. Stephen Rios was the one who placed Jesse under arrest and issued him a municipal court summons for obstructing a governmental operation. This, Rios claimed, was the extent of his relationship with Jesse. He insisted that their interaction ended there and that there had been no further contact between them. Yet this conflicted with the story provided by Jesse's friend Andy, who claimed that Jesse and Rios had been involved in a sexual relationship. The detectives sought additional insight by speaking with Jesse's family, particularly his mother, Linda. It was becoming increasingly critical to determine the truth about the connection between Stephen Rios and Jesse Valencia. Linda Valencia recalled her son mentioning the police officer who had arrested him back in April. Although Linda didn't know the officer's name, and some sources suggest Jesse didn't know it either, Jesse had told her the officer was very nice and unusually talkative. He had described the officer as being genuinely interested in him, asking Jesse lots of questions about his life. Jesse also told his mother that just one day after the arrest, the same officer showed up at his apartment without any prior notice. The officer claimed he needed to follow up on the incident from the party, saying he had more questions to ask Jesse about what had happened. However, according to Jesse, the officer barely mentioned the party. Instead, he continued asking Jesse personal questions about his life. The nature of the officer's inquiries suggested he wasn't there for professional reasons, but rather because he wanted to know more about Jesse. Linda told detectives that this wasn't the last time the officer appeared in Jesse's life. The two stayed in contact after the visit, going out together on several occasions and spending time at Jesse's apartment. According to Linda, the officer would often show up at Jesse's place unannounced, typically late at night or in the early hours of the morning. But Linda wasn't the only one who had heard about this police officer. Jesse's friend Andy had already shared details of their encounters, and now another friend, Joan, came forward with her own account. Joan told detectives that Jesse had confided in her about the police officer he was seeing. Jesse had told Joan that the officer would frequently visit his apartment, usually late at night. These visits often ended with them sleeping together, after which the officer would leave without lingering. Joan also had a personal encounter with the officer. She explained that one night, while she was at Jesse's apartment, the officer showed up unannounced. When detectives later showed Joan a photo lineup of officers, she immediately identified Stephen Rios as the man she had seen that night. At this point, 3 people, Linda, Andy, and Joan, had all corroborated similar details about Jesse's relationship with a police officer. 2 of those individuals, Andy and Joan, had explicitly identified Stephen Rios as the officer in question. The evidence against Rios wasn't yet definitive proof of guilt, but it strongly suggested he had been in a secret relationship with Jesse in the weeks leading up to his murder. Rios had not disclosed this relationship to his colleagues or investigators, raising further suspicions about his involvement. As detectives continued speaking with Joan, they uncovered even more troubling details about the officer and his connection to Jesse. Detectives investigating Jesse Valencia's murder identified a possible motive for why Stephen Rios might have wanted Jesse dead. Following Jesse's arrest at the party in April, Rios had issued him a court summons for obstructing a governmental operation. After Rios and Jesse began their occasional sexual relationship, Jesse assumed that the court proceedings would quietly be dropped. He believed that Rios, now personally involved with him, would ensure that the charges were dismissed. However, Jesse was wrong. The summons remained active, and Jesse was still required to appear in court. This realization left Jesse feeling frustrated and betrayed. He was angry that Rios hadn't intervened to dismiss the charge. Jesse confided in his friend Joan, expressing his anger toward Rios over the situation. In the weeks leading up to his death, Jesse told Joan that the next time Rios visited his apartment, he planned to threaten him. Jesse said he would tell Rios that, unless he dropped the charge, he would expose their relationship to the Columbia police chief. This revelation could have been devastating for Rios. He was sleeping with someone he had arrested and charged, a serious breach of professional conduct. The consequences for Rios, should Jesse follow through with this threat, would have been catastrophic. Professionally, his career would have been in jeopardy. Personally, his marriage would have been at risk, as his wife had no idea he was cheating. Rios wasn't just having an affair. He was cheating with a man, a college student, which added a layer of complexity and potential humiliation. Given the cultural and personal pressures Rios might have faced, it's possible that he was also struggling with his sexuality. His secret relationship with Jesse seemed to be something he kept hidden out of shame or fear. Rios's late-night visits to Jesse's apartment, always unannounced and under the cover of darkness, reflected his desire to keep the relationship a secret. The prospect of Jesse exposing this secret could have been enough to push Rios toward a desperate and irreversible decision. Based on these insights from Joan, Andy, and Jesse's mother, Linda, Stephen Rios quickly became the prime suspect in the case. However, the detectives decided not to act immediately. They wanted to build a solid case against Rios before making any moves. Accusing a fellow officer of murder was not something they could do lightly, especially without significant evidence. The detectives chose to wait for the results of the DNA tests from the lab, which could potentially tie Rios to the crime. Plans were disrupted when Stephen Rios unexpectedly came forward on his own. Rios approached the detectives investigating Jesse's murder, saying that he wanted to talk to them. At first, the detectives thought he might be about to confess. The idea that Rios would voluntarily come forward raised their hopes. However, it quickly became clear that Rios had no intention of admitting to anything. During the conversation, Rios acknowledged that he had heard rumors circulating about Jesse having an affair with a Columbia police officer. He told the detectives that he had met Jesse only once, when he arrested him at the party and issued the court summons. According to Rios, that was the extent of their relationship. He denied any further contact or involvement with Jesse. It was a transparent attempt to deflect suspicion and throw the detectives off his trail. What Rios didn't realize was that the detectives already had multiple statements from people in Jesse's life that contradicted his story. These accounts painted a clear picture of Rios's secret relationship with Jesse, a secret that was now unraveling around him. The evidence mounting against Stephen Rios was becoming undeniable. Detectives confronted Rios, explaining that multiple witnesses had identified him as the officer Jesse had been involved with. They informed him that Jesse's female friend, Joan, had seen Rios show up unannounced at Jesse's apartment one evening. Hearing this, Rios changed his story. He admitted that after meeting Jesse in April, they had started getting to know each other and had become friends. However, Rios was adamant that their relationship was purely platonic. He denied any romantic or sexual involvement. Detectives then brought up Andy's statement, telling Rios that another of Jesse's friends claimed to have been at Jesse's apartment when Rios knocked on the door and joined them in bed. Rios grew defensive, calling Andy's account a lie and accusing him of fabricating the story. But as the detectives pressed him and made it clear they didn't believe him, Rios changed his story again. He finally admitted that he and Jesse had slept together, but initially claimed it had only happened once. As the questioning continued, Rios admitted that he and Jesse had been intimate around 6 times. Despite this admission, Rios vehemently denied having anything to do with Jesse's murder. Detectives then asked Rios to account for his movements on the night Jesse was killed. Rios said he had been working that night and finished his shift at 3 a.m. Afterward, he went out with a couple of fellow officers to have drinks on the rooftop of a nearby parking garage. He claimed they stayed there for a few hours before he left and went straight home, arriving around 5:15 to 5:30 a.m. After providing this timeline, Rios was allowed to leave, as the police still lacked solid evidence to charge him. With his account on record, detectives began meticulously checking his story to see if it held up. They spoke to Rios's wife, who confirmed that he returned home that night, at the time he stated, around 5:15 to 5:30 a.m. They also interviewed the officers Rios had been with, and they corroborated his account of finishing their shifts at 3 a.m. and going to the rooftop for drinks. However, when detectives reviewed security door records from the parking garage, they uncovered a discrepancy. The records showed that Rios left the rooftop at 4:37 a.m. The journey from the parking garage to his home was less than 4 minutes, yet both Rios and his wife claimed he didn't arrive until after 5:15 a.m. This left at least 38 minutes of unaccounted time, possibly more, since his wife suggested he might have arrived closer to 5:30 a.m. The journey from Rios's house to Jesse's apartment was about 10 minutes, meaning he had the time and opportunity to go to Jesse's apartment that night. Detectives believed this gap in time might have been when Rios committed the murder. In an effort to uncover more evidence, police searched Rios's house for anything that could link him to Jesse's death. Unfortunately, the search turned up nothing incriminating. They also searched his car and his locker at work, but again, they found nothing that definitively tied him to the crime. Despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives were increasingly convinced that Rios was the killer. It was a difficult conclusion to reach, especially because Rios was one of their own, but the circumstantial evidence pointed squarely at him. Rios seemed to realize the walls were closing in. One day, a Colombia detective received a distressing phone call from him. On the call, Rios was crying and hysterical, saying, "I've done a bad thing." When asked where he was, Rios revealed that he was in Kansas City, a couple of hours away from Colombia. He also admitted that he was armed with a gun and appeared to be considering suicide. It seemed as though Rios wanted to end his life to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. Fortunately, the detective managed to calm him down and convinced him to return to Colombia so they could sort this out. As soon as Rios returned, the case took a critical turn. Stephen Rios was committed to a mental health care facility and placed on a 96-hour hold to prevent him from harming himself. He was monitored closely during his stay, as the police and mental health staff feared he might attempt suicide. However, Rios didn't remain at the facility for long. In a shocking turn of events, he managed to escape. Upon fleeing, Rios made his way to the roof of a parking garage. This might have been the same parking garage where he had been drinking with colleagues on the night of Jesse Valencia's murder, though this detail remains unclear. Once on the roof, Rios prepared to end his life. He intended to jump. As soon as the police were alerted to his escape, they began an urgent search to locate him. They quickly tracked him down to the parking garage roof, where he stood, ready to leap. Officers rushed to the scene and tried to talk Rios down, pleading with him not to take his own life. The situation attracted significant attention from the public. By 7 p.m., a crowd had gathered, watching anxiously as police attempted to prevent Rios from jumping. The standoff continued for about 45 minutes, during which Rios seemed torn but unwilling to step away from the ledge. Thankfully, after nearly an hour of negotiations, detectives succeeded in convincing Rios to come down from the roof. Once he was safely off the roof, Rios was once again placed in a psychiatric facility and put under suicide watch. While Rios remained under care, the detectives continued building their case, searching for solid evidence to prove that he was Jesse Valencia's killer. 3 weeks after Jesse's death, the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for finally arrived: the DNA test results. During Jesse's autopsy, scientists had taken samples from under his fingernails, and these samples contained DNA. The results revealed that some of the DNA found under Jesse's fingernails was a match to Stephen Rios. Additionally, forensic experts had tested the hairs found on Jesse's chest. These limb hairs, which came from either an arm or a leg, were also determined to be a match to Stephen Rios. With this critical forensic evidence, detectives began to piece together a theory about what might have happened on the night of Jesse's murder. They realized that as a police officer, Rios would have known how to execute a chokehold, a method designed to control or incapacitate someone. They theorized that Rios had put Jesse in a chokehold during their confrontation, possibly in an attempt to subdue him. Placement of Rios's arm during the chokehold could explain how his limb hairs ended up on Jesse's chest. It also fit with the autopsy findings, which indicated that Jesse had been unconscious when his throat was cut. The bruises found on Jesse's body, on his chest, shoulders, and back, were consistent with injuries caused by a chokehold struggle. Detectives speculated that Jesse had tried to free himself by pulling at Rios's arms, but explained both the bruising and the presence of Rios's DNA under Jesse's fingernails. They believed that once Jesse was rendered unconscious by the chokehold, Rios used the opportunity to fatally cut his throat. Everything was beginning to add up, and the detectives finally felt they had enough evidence to make an arrest. On July 1st, 2004, just under a month after Jesse Valencia's murder, Stephen Rios was officially arrested and charged with murder, was charged with first-degree murder, but despite the mounting evidence against him, he maintained his innocence. At his trial, Rios pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution laid out their account of what they believed had happened on the night of Jesse Valencia's murder. Based on the evidence and testimony gathered, the prosecution painted a chilling picture of the events of June 5th, 2004. They theorized that after Rios finished his shift and had drinks with his colleagues, he went straight to Jesse's apartment, intending to sleep with him. However, when Rios arrived, Jesse was angry and unwilling to continue their secret affair. The prosecution suggested that Jesse's frustration stemmed from two main issues. First, Jesse was upset that Rios hadn't dismissed the court summons he had issued after Jesse's arrest. Second, Jesse had recently discovered that Rios was married and had a young child, information Rios had withheld from him. Jesse confronted Rios about his lies, making it clear he was no longer comfortable with the situation. During this heated argument, Jesse threatened to expose their affair to the Columbia police chief. The prosecution argued that this threat pushed Rios into a panic. He knew the consequences of Jesse exposing their relationship. His career would be destroyed, his family would be shattered, and his reputation would be ruined. Desperate to protect himself, Rios decided to silence Jesse permanently. The prosecution suggested that Rios began attacking Jesse inside his apartment, becoming aggressive and violent. Fearing for his life, Jesse likely ran out of the apartment, wearing only his blue boxers, with Rios chasing after him. Jesse's attempts to escape were futile. Likely intoxicated after attending a party earlier that night, he was unable to run at full speed. Rios caught up to Jesse in the grass between the apartment buildings and grabbed him from behind, placing him in a chokehold. Although Rios had received training in applying chokeholds as part of his defensive tactics course, the prosecution noted that he had failed the course. This lack of proficiency might explain why Jesse sustained bruises on his chest, shoulders, and back during the struggle. As Rios attempted to render Jesse unconscious, Jesse fought back, leaving scratches and bruises on Rios's arms. Eventually, Rios succeeded in choking Jesse until he passed out. With Jesse unconscious, Rios took out a knife, likely carried in his pocket, and cut Jesse's throat, ensuring he would bleed out and die. Rios then fled the scene, leaving Jesse's body to be discovered by college students hours later. The defense, however, presented an entirely different narrative, denying Rios's involvement in the murder. While they admitted Rios had slept with Jesse, they argued that he was not the killer. In a controversial move, the defense attempted to shift suspicion away from Rios by attacking Jesse's character. They portrayed Jesse as volatile, promiscuous, and manipulative, suggesting that any of the many men he allegedly slept with could have killed him. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before delivering their verdict in May 2005, less than a year after Jesse's death. They found Stephen Rios guilty of first-degree murder, agreeing with the prosecution's version of events. However, Rios quickly appealed the conviction, and the Missouri Court of Appeals overturned it. The court ruled that hearsay statements, deemed inadmissible, had been used during the trial, necessitating a retrial. The second trial took place in 2008, 4 years after Jesse's murder. This time, Rios was found guilty of second-degree murder instead of first-degree. It's believed the jury concluded the murder wasn't premeditated. Rather, Rios went to Jesse's apartment for sex and only decided to kill him when he felt threatened. Rios was also convicted of armed criminal action during the retrial. He was sentenced to life in prison for second-degree murder with an additional 23 years for the armed criminal action charge. While Rios is unlikely to ever be released, he will be eligible for parole in 2049. And that concludes the case of 23-year-old Jesse Valencia, a story that is as tragic as it is unsettling. It's a deeply disturbing case, not only because of Jesse's brutal murder, but also because of who committed the crime. The killer was a police officer, someone entrusted with the duty of protecting and serving the public, someone the community is meant to rely on for safety. The betrayal of that trust adds a layer of horror to this already heartbreaking story. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this case. What do you make of the events leading up to Jesse's death? And what do you think about the trial and verdict? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'll see you next time with another true crime documentary. Until then, take care and stay safe.